the first time, as I stepped on Soviet soil, I felt myself a full human being. A full human being. So it is unthinkable to me today that colored peoples in any part of the world would ever join a war or attacks upon the Soviet Union.
Hello everyone, it's your host Tony. Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism. What you just heard is a clip of famous actor, American civil rights figure, and socialist Paul Robeson briefly discussing the lack of racism he experienced in the Soviet Union and the solidarity the Soviet Union's stance on anti-racism and anti-colonialism engendered in racialized people around the world. If you're a new listener, the focus of this show is to talk about socialist countries, past and present, often speaking to those with first-hand experience or expert knowledge. We've covered socialist countries such as Laos, North Korea, Cuba, East Germany, Mongolia, among others. And for this episode, we'll be going back again to the OG socialist country, Soviet Union. Today I'm back again with guest Henry Hakamäki, a immunobiologist, and as you likely already know, the co-host of the fantastic Guerrilla History podcast, and Salvatore Engel-Di Mauro, author of Socialist States and the Environment, Lessons of Eco-Socialist Futures. Salvatore is a professor at the Geography Department of SUNY New Paltz. This episode is the final part of a two-part discussion between the three of us. We'll be continuing the discussion of their new authorized English translation of Italian communist and historian Domenico Lusurdo's landmark work, Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. Published by Iskra Books, you can find this book on their website linked in the show notes as a PDF for free. That's right. Again, you can get a free PDF copy of this book on their website. I highly recommend that if you can, order a physical copy in paperback or hardcover. In this episode, we're going to move into the specifics of the often airbrushed history of anti-racist and anti-colonial policies under Stalin's Soviet Union, and even ponder whether Stalin's impact on these material objectives is more substantive than that of, say for example, civil rights figure and fellow socialist Martin Luther King Jr. We also discuss the equally airbrushed links between liberal Western democracies and Nazi fascism. And we do all of this in the spirit of Domenico Losurdo's work, in which we continue to deconstruct, evaluate, and critique the black legends attributed to Stalin. This show is 100% listener funded and is a solo production, so anything you can spare will go a long way in having me continue this educational project, which requires research, writing, editing, recording, and other work to put together. So if you do wish to contribute as a Patreon subscriber, you'll also gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content which are currently under development depending on when you're listening to this. So shout out to my patrons in allowing me to continue this project. If you're unable to contribute financially, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode by following us on Twitter at ASThePodcast. You can also subscribe to this show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, etc. Also, feel free to leave a review if you have time, or even just a star rating. This helps with the algorithm. I recommend checking out the back catalog as well when you have the chance. As always, you can really help the show the most by engaging in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be. The opening included for this episode is a recreation using the transcript of Paul Robeson's testimony to the anti-communist and McCarthyist the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which Paul Robeson was called to testify to in 1956. This recreation featured the voice of James Earl Jones voicing Paul Robeson, and in this clip, Robeson speaks highly of the Soviet Union's anti-racist stance in a world in which segregation and apartheid were the standard throughout the West and in their colonies.
Did you write an article that was published in the USSR Information Bulletin?
Yes.
Quote, I want to emphasize that only here in the Soviet Union did I feel that I was a real man with a capital M, close quote.
I would say, what is your name?
Aaron.
I am quite willing to answer the question. When I was a singer years ago, and this you will have to listen to.
I am listening.
I am a bass singer, so for me, it was Chelyabin, the great Russian bass, not Caruso the tenor. I learned the Russian language to sing their songs. I wish you would listen now.
Mr. Chairman, I ask you to direct the witness to answer the question.
Just be fair with me.
I ask for order.
The great poet of Russia is of African blood.
Let us not go
It
so
is
far
important to
afield.
explain this.
Did you make that statement?
When I first went to Russia in 1934.
Did you make that
When I
statement?
first went to Russia in
Did you
1934.
make that statement?
In Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi. No color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being. But I do not feel the pressure of color as I feel it in this committee today.
Why do you not stay in Russia?
Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?
You are here because you are promoting the communist cause.
I am here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees.
The book, and I think even this might be misconception as well, is that the book isn't like a biography of Stalin. Rather, not at all. So rather it, addresses or analyzes different constructs, historical constructs of Stalin. Salvatore, you'd mentioned this, flip switch from the way Stalin was presented during World War II to after it. One example Lusurdo points out is in regards to anti-Semitism. And this kind of blew my mind when he pointed it out. Prior to World War II and the rise of Nazism, the Soviet Union was, of course, there's the allegation by those in the West, particularly by capitalists, by anti-Semites, that the Soviet Union was, and communism in general, was some ploy created by Jewish people to either enslave Europeans or something of that sort. Stalin and Lenin and all those people were viewed as being essentially puppets of this larger Jewish conspiracy that even Marx, going back all those years too, was a part of. And because Jewish people were seen as the kind of like this biggest amorphous threat, communism had to be attached to it. Following World War II, however, now that Nazism was the big enemy of the West, and Nazism was specifically tied to anti-Semitism as one of their main tenets, Stalin now had to be imputed with those same characteristics of now being an anti-Semite, because Stalin is now our worst enemy. So that kind of flip was, is I think a very clear example of how these constructs of Stalin are presented. So moving into looking at like a specific area of concepts in regards to how Stalin is presented, it's in one of his works. It isn't actually in this book, but he wrote a short article called Stalin and Hitler, Twin Brothers or Mortal Enemies. And he covers some of the same content, of course, in A Black Legend. And in it, he makes the case that that the Soviet Union under Stalin essentially was the lead of a huge anti-colonial, decolonial movement, the biggest, essentially, effort that's ever existed. And this kind of flew in the face of everything that I'd understood. Before I think I moved to the left, I was very interested in civil rights history, in anti-racism, and things of that sort. And I always kind of assumed that, like, say I'm in Canada, Canadians kind of supplant their own history with American history, so you learn about things that are happening there. So the civil rights movement, MLK, and it's as if these movements only existed in the U.S. and kind of spread from the U.S. As in MLK was kind of, say for example, one person kind of inspired these other movements that were happening around the world, when, in reality, actions that he would push for in the US, such as affirmative action and many other programs like that, had already been implemented in the Soviet Union by the 60s for about 40 years. So that kind of, it's one of those things that, doesn't get talked about enough. Did either of you have any comments in regards to the anti-colonial, construction of Stalin?
It's fantastic that you're raising this because it is not widespread knowledge as it should be. It should be like household knowledge, actually. Paul Robeson, Paul Robeson went to the USSR not for just, having a nice holiday visit. For him, and rightfully so, the USSR was a beacon of fighting for freedom for new Africans in the Americas. And there was plenty of support coming from the Bolshevik side for that effort. And a lot of communists actually even died on the streets for the cause. This is way before, I'm talking about the 1930s. This is before the what is made out to be as if they were like sort of almost out of the blue civil rights movement, which wasn't, which involved many communists, especially black communists. This story really needs to be told over and over again. And with respect to Canada, I don't know if you know the work of Hakim Adi, who has been unceremoniously sacked by his university in the United Kingdom. He's a leading Pan-Africanist historian, and I would strongly recommend everyone to read his work. But he points out...
And just to add in very quickly, so listeners, as I'm sure was mentioned in the introduction, I co-host Guerrilla History. We just recently had an episode with Hakamäki to talk about his impending axing from the University of Chichester, where he was, leading a Master's of Research program on African and African diaspora history. And as Salvatore says, he really is a critical scholar, and the sacking of him was a travesty. So if you do want to know a little bit more about that, without us talking too much about it here, go to the Guerrilla History feed, wherever you get your podcasts, and listen to that conversation where we talk with Professor Adi about that program that he leads and the reasons why he thinks he was going to be sacked, which ultimately then was carried out about a week and a half after we had that episode. Anyway, sorry for the interruption, Salvatore.
No, by all means. Thanks. No, I wanted to add that Hakamäki points out that actually Montreal in Canada, or Quebec, or however you want to see it, was a hotbed of Pan-Africanist radicalism and civil rights radicalism, and it's been written out of history. It's in the mainstream. It's as if it never existed. I mean, there were more than just a few fistfights going on there in order to, make the point with respect to the settler colonial racism that Canada represents. So in any case, it is one could go on, I suppose, but it's not just with the Stalin government. This started, of course, with the Comintern. From the get-go, the Lenin, Zinoviev, all the the major Bolsheviks were for national self-determination, which is a very tricky thing. It's not something that one can just kid about and say, every people will have to be involved in national self-determination, regardless of whether it's going to be a feudal, lord, that determines that so-called self-determination. So you have to be, so they had to really balance things out. And in any case, one should look at the early post-1917 history as that effort as well of providing the conditions for real self-determination rather than reintroduction of basically monarchies or what have you, with the excuse of self-determination. I would mention, for example, the Buryat example as something that is really tricky, and to compare it with the Birobidzhan, example where Jews could safely go and at least have a much safer area to be living under, with respect to all the pogroms and the insane racism of the 1920s and 30s that they were subjected to. No, I mean, there'll be so much else that one could talk about. I mean, but it's not. It's from the get-go, and it goes all the way through the 1980s. That the USSR is aiding national liberation movements the world over.
Yeah, and just to underscore that Birobidzhan example that Salvatore mentioned, because I think the vast majority of listeners will be unfamiliar with that. This is Birobidzhan is the capital of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, which is one of the federal districts of Russia, and at the time, the Soviet Union. It's just to the north of China. It's pretty far to the east. But the reason it's called the Jewish Autonomous Oblast is because, like Salvatore was mentioning, there was all of these terrible pogroms and then eventually, the Holocaust in Nazi Germany that was being carried out, outside of Nazi Germany as well, that the Stalin government decided that they would put this kind of safe space within the Soviet Union for the Jewish community to come together, preserve their culture, have their culture enshrined within that area, and, be safe from all of this persecution that they were facing across Europe and up until the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. It's worth mentioning that the pogroms were taking place left and right across Imperial Russia up until 1917, and also during the Civil War by the Whites. There was the White Terror, part of that was anti-Jewish pogroms.
Can I interject? The White armies were the pro-Tsarist armies.
That's correct. So yes, the forces that the Bolsheviks were opposing in the Russian Civil War. Immediately after the Russian Civil War and the foundation of the Soviet Union, the pogroms were completely wiped out. and in large part due to the intervention of Stalin, turning it back to the focus of our book, not only in terms of creating this Jewish space within the Soviet Union, but also it's worth mentioning, and we're talking about national self-determination. There's a work, you may have heard of it, Marxism and the National Question. It was written by ... Joseph Stalin, who of course was tasked by Lenin himself to be in charge of nationality policy, the national question within the Soviet Union, while Lenin was leading things. And then of course, when Stalin, especially when he first came to power, he also was very firm on the national question within the Soviet Union. There was some mistakes that were made later on. Again, talked about a little bit in this book. We've talked about in other interviews, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But point is in those early days in particular, Stalin was a very firm defender of national self-determination and national liberation. And then looking outside of the borders of the Soviet Union, all through Stalin's period in leading the government, and then even afterwards, the Soviet Union was a committed anti-colonial, anti-imperial force. And we only have to look at examples across Africa to see the impacts that the Soviet Union was having in terms of supporting and fostering national liberation and self-determination movements across that continent, as well as elsewhere. But I also think one thing that's worth mentioning is that in addition to this kind of material support that they were giving, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and then the Soviet Union was an inspiration for these national liberation movements. This was something that was held up by national liberation movements across the globe. And this is something that's talked about in various works. Walter Rodney's, the works that were put together from Walter Rodney, The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World. We have Vijay Prasad's Red Star Over the Third World. These are the sorts of works that are looking at what sort of impact did the Bolshevik Revolution have in terms of inspiring these movements outside, particularly in the Third World. And I think that this is a legacy that can't be, we should not understate. This is a critically important legacy that they had. And of course, it's important that they were providing material support to these national liberation movements, but even the inspiration that they were providing from the example of their own revolution and what they were fighting for, the society that they were trying to construct, that in itself is worth lauding.
Kind of going back to both the points that you're making, previous episodes I've done on the show, I've had Gerald Horn on to talk about how the Soviet Union, East Germany, and other socialist countries really helped out the efforts in defeating apartheid in South Africa and other Southern African states. So I recommend checking that out. I've done episodes with Alice and Dennis Bartels in regards to their book, When the North Was Red. And it's a book which focuses on the northern peoples of the Soviet Union. So the many different nationalities and groups up in the far north. And in that discussion, we talk about the different affirmative action programs that were instituted. And it's incredibly interesting in terms of language, in terms of education, in terms of jobs, in terms of technology sharing, so much. But again, not enough time. Kind of sticking to this discussion of anti-colonialism, civil rights, anti-racism. I feel like normally absent the socialist and communist influence of these movements, what you hear often is that, after World War I, African-American soldiers came back, or African soldiers who fought for France or whoever came back home, and suddenly, they got the courage, or they thought differently for some reason that we won't mention about how their countries are being colonized. But of course, it was the impact of an example of the October Revolution and what was going on there, which greatly influenced colonial people all over the world. So I did want to make that point.
If I may, can I add one quick thing? So, mentioning about how these individuals that were, fighting for example, for France in World War II from the French colonies, they would go home and then they would think, look how we're being treated by the French, the people that we're fighting for. That is in some cases true. I mean, we have examples like the Théoroy massacre, where we had a camp in Senegal where these Senegalese, also there was many other West African, French colonized soldiers who were fighting in the French army during World War II. These individuals began fighting with the French army in 1940 and for several years, obviously losing many people in defense of France against Nazi Germany. And, of course, it's worth lauding their efforts in resisting Nazi fascism. But what happened was in 1944, they had been sent back to West Africa, after the kind of tide of the war had begun to turn. And they were put back in this military camp with really poor conditions. And then the French were reneging on their promises in terms of payment to them, where they had been promised, a normal French kind of military pension. And when they were sent back down, the French kind of changed their mind and decided that they deserved only an African military pension rather than the French military pension, despite fighting in the French military. So there was these protests that were breaking out in this camp, in the Camp de Théoroy. And, well, what did the French do? They didn't say, oh, you're right, we did promise you a French military pension. No, they sent in the tanks and they slaughtered over 400 of these West African soldiers that had fought in the French army against Nazi fascism, for years, losing hundreds of other individuals that were fighting for France. Because the French didn't want to pay them what they had already promised them. They went in and they butchered these people in their own camp, rolling over them with tanks, lighting their barracks on fire. I mean, absolute terrible, terrible instance of, colonial depravity. Something that is not talked about in the West at all, although there is a pretty good movie that's based on it, which I do highly recommend. It's called Camp de Théoroy. It's by the Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembene. So do check that out. It's fairly accurate. Of course, it's a movie, so there's going to be some, changes that have been made for dramatic effect. But, in any case, this was, a terrible event. You can't just boil it down to saying, the people went back home and they saw how the French were treating them. It's also having that alternative vision that's provided by an example like a Soviet Union of saying, hey, look, we do believe in national liberation. We have constructed a new society. You can't only inspire people based on negative conditions. You also have to provide these positive, inspirational examples. And those two things coming together is really what allows for successful national liberation movements, where people come together and they're willing to overcome any sort of hardship and oppression and backlash that they're facing by their colonial oppressors. It's important to keep that in mind, that you can't only have that negative, but you also have to have some sort of positive feeling. And of course they did. The Soviet Union was not like some hidden example that nobody had heard of in 1944. Like, everybody knew by that point what the Soviet Union was about. It was in the media. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. To kind of add on to what you said, I mean, particularly during World War II, there's a huge, I guess you'd call it, propaganda campaign to talk positively about the Soviet Union in American and Western publications and Time magazine, where you get really detailed, actually positive representations of the Soviet Union. Again, sticking with this anti-colonial point, if the Soviet Union often is positioned as that force, maybe the general perspective, or at least the perspective that I grew up with, was that in the start of the 20th century, there was liberal democracy, Canada, the US, and they're kind of the normal state of things, and that's how things should be. And then two different ideologies kind of sprung up. There's fascism and Nazism on one side and communism on the other side, both kind of like aberrations from normative liberal democracy. And Lusurdo in his work really illustrates that, in fact, Nazism and fascism really is just an outgrowth of Western liberal democracy and their colonial project around the world. And this isn't really, it's not an obscure thing. If you look at what the Nazis and Hitler said, very clearly they based their entire war really of expanding eastward into Eastern Europe. They compared it to Manifest Destiny in the US, where they would take over the land, they would displace the native populations, the Slavs in Eastern Europe, the indigenous peoples, First Nations in North America. The Nazis, they actually built their racial laws on what the US was doing. They studied those in particular. Again, this is another Lusurdo thing that I feel like he's the only person who's like ever mentioned this, because I always only see him mention it, is that the concept or the term Untermenschen, or like underman, which the Nazis used, isn't like a German a German originated word. It was based off an American racist describing black people, right? And it's like when one is able to understand and learn that, it really reshapes the understanding of the trajectories of colonialism and liberal democracies, which ruled over colonial countries, and really in repositioning the Soviet Union more accurately as that anti-colonial force. Any comments to that specific point?
So I'll let Salvatore answer this, but I do want to throw out one other book recommendation quick first before I forget, which is you mentioned that, many of the Nazi ideas in terms of legal ideas were inspired by things like Manifest Destiny. There's a really great book that examines, and the author is not a radical. He's an Ivy League law professor, but the book is Hitler's American Model. I've wanted to interview the author for quite some time to talk about that book, even though, again, he's not like a far left author, but he's quite busy and he's always told me too busy to talk. But anyway, the book is really great and it examines how the Nazi legal code, specifically the Nuremberg laws, series of 3 laws that came out, were all inspired by examples from the United States, whether that was law, whether that was by historical example, the treatment of the Native Americans, the subjugation of the African Americans, etc. In many cases, racial quotas in terms of what was coming into the country, like all of these things came together to inspire the Nazi legal code. And it's not a long book, and it's actually quite a decent read as well. Like you'd think that, law professor writing about, historical law might not be the most entertaining read. It's pretty good. So listeners, that's one of the recommendations that I'd have for you if you're interested in how the United States, in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, inspired the legal code for Nazi Germany. Hitler's American Model. The name of the author escapes me for the moment. But anyway, Salvatore, go ahead.
The author is James Whitman. That's fantastic. I was going to mention exactly that book. Tony, you articulate the issues so well. I'm not sure I can add anything to it. Perhaps reading Gerald Horne has also helped me over the years a great deal. A fantastic resource in order to understand what liberal democracy actually means. And I've come to understand liberal democracy in that way over the years. I also had to have sort of a wake-up call to that effect. I was just recommending. Well, Gerald Horne you already mentioned, but I mean he's been an inspiration to me for quite a number of years. But in terms of understanding what liberal democracy actually means, Losurdo also has, of course, a book that it seems like Gerald Horne and Losurdo have gone through like in parallel ways without meeting, which is unfortunate. But Losurdo's book on liberalism, a counter history, that's the title of that book, is very much in line with what Horne has been writing. Although Horne is much more powerful in terms of the empirical evidence that he brings forth and the arguments. But liberal democracy, it was a very heavy kind of task that was created not a little distress for a number of weeks. But I tabulated just in terms of war deaths, how much liberal democracy has contributed directly to war deaths alone, and I published that. And it turns out that even if one wants to insist on quote unquote communism, like killing millions of people, liberal democracies actually end up killing 8 times more than all of the so-called, it's a misnomer anyway to say communist states, but, socialist states combined, right? And I mean, I suspected something to that effect, but such a huge difference. And it's astonishing how well in liberal democracies, very straightforward evidence is withheld from view so effectively. I mean, liberal democracy is genocide. That's what it's founded on, genocide and slavery. It's quite amazing. So it's they try very hard to project all of that onto the Soviet Union, onto maybe now the People's Republic of China. But it's just, you don't have to go very far to understand what liberal democracy really means. You can just go to your nearby reservations in Canada or the United States to understand what liberal democracy really means. And of course, all the abundant evidence of what slavery systems have, all the horrific long-term consequences on New Africans in the Americas. I mean, it's astonishing how they get away with this. That is what is astonishing. So, of course, Hitler, Nazis would draw from the United States. It makes complete sense. I mean, especially because they did get away with it. So why shouldn't the Nazis get away with it, right? I mean, it makes absolute sense in that regard. Anyway, just wanted to add a few things on that. And so whenever, people on the left will come across stuff like the 100 million, deaths by communism, just tally up the results, and you'll find that it's first of all that's just a fake number, it's complete fabrication, and secondly, even if it were, and capitalism is way more deadly than anything else ever existed in humanity's history, and so on that alone, there's just no possible argument for anti-communists left.
Another quick recommendation for people is that if you're interested in the origins of that, communism killed 100 million people number, which, as Salvatore mentioned, is a complete falsehood. My Guerrilla History co-host, Brett O'Shea, on his other show, Revolutionary Left Radio, has a really great episode that focuses on the Black Book of Communism, which is this, complete ahistorical political hack job. And Brett and the guests of that episode kind of take that work apart and show, the origins of the argument that communism killed millions of people and how that number has been inflated and inflated and inflated over the years. But the methodology for coming to that number is very strange. I mean, it includes things like Nazis killed during World War II or a death attributable to communism. Like, really, this is the sort of argumentation we want to go for in terms of like, this is why communism is bad. And that's not to say that deaths didn't occur under, socialist states. But this sort of complete ahistorical, politically motivated hack job doesn't do anyone any good, because it's a complete misaccounting of what the actual, mistakes that were made by these states were. And as Salvatore mentioned, if you tried to tabulate things in the same way that the Black Book of Communism tries to do, which is to say, a terrible job of tabulating things, just attributing everything that is even, if the word communism is in the same paragraph as this death, you attribute this death to, to communism. One of the things that they also attributed was like people that weren't even born. They said, oh, the birth rate declined during World War II, and therefore we're also going to add an X number of millions of people because this was a communist state and the birth numbers decreased, and therefore it was the same as, killing this many people because there was this many less people around. Like, think about how insane that logic is. During World War II, the birth rate declined. Really? Who could have seen that coming? And that all of a sudden became attributable as a death due to communism. So if you tried to tabulate things in a remotely the same way, which is to say a very bad way, capitalism still comes out infinitely worse than communism does, infinitely worse. And, Salvatore, the fact that you tried to tabulate that is, a credit to you. But I think that this whole tabulation process in general is, it's kind of silly in many ways because of how that can easily be done politically, like, births that were lost due to, whatever, like, it's crazy. So, that's all I have to say on that.
Salvatore, you did mention how liberal democracies are very good at covering up their own crimes or genocides, etc. The Black Book of Communism is one product of that. The way Stalin is presented is one product of that. And, the Victims of Communism Foundation is a thing. It's, of course, sponsored by the U.S. government as Canada, America's little sibling or whatever. We are in the process now, I think it's been over a decade, that they've been constructing a Victims of Communism museum funded by the federal government. It's a huge money pit. It's been, of course, controversial. Some of the names that people had submitted to be remembered as part of one of the exhibits had like Nazi collaborators, of course, and people of that sort. So
this is going to be extra controversial, but allow me to be controversial for 1 second. I'm sure that given the current geopolitical situation that we're seeing in Europe right now, that there's going to be as a result of this, there's going to be an even greater push for including more Nazi collaborators in these memorials to victims of communism. I really don't have to be more specific than that, because I'm sure that people are already seeing this phenomenon happening in terms of Nazi collaborators during World War II. But if they were from the right nationality or living in the right place, it doesn't really matter. As long as they were fighting communism and they weren't from Nazi Germany, then it was okay. If they were from any other place other than Nazi Germany or Italy, even if they were fighting alongside Nazis, it was good. I say this is not the specific example that I was kind of alluding to, which I'm not going to say because, where I live and, all of that. I'm sure that it'll be controversial enough just me saying that. But the listeners, I'm sure, know what I'm talking about. But just another example is my heritage is half of it's from Finland, half of it's from Italy. Look at the example of Finland and how they're always heralded as, this shining pillar of wonderful, perfect country with a beautiful history. They were Nazi collaborators for years. As a state, they were Nazi collaborators for years. But it's always whitewashed as, but they were standing up to communist aggression as Nazi collaborators. And, that's completely then, it doesn't matter that they were Nazi collaborators. There was, communism was involved. Therefore, it's okay. They weren't from Nazi Germany. They were fighting against communists. It doesn't matter that they were collaborating with Nazis. It really doesn't. But even the Finnish Air Force was still using swastikas on their planes until less than a decade ago. Listeners, think about this for a second. I mean, the swastika has been completely banned in most European countries. And it's very taboo anywhere outside of India, where it has a different connotation due to history. The Finnish Air Force was using swastikas on their wings and the tail fin of their planes, I think up until about 7 years ago. This is the legacy here. We're talking about Nazi collaborators and then even appropriating symbology from the Nazis. But because they weren't from Nazi Germany, it's okay. And if they were killed, if an individual there was killed fighting alongside Nazis by a Soviet, troop. And, that's not to say that the Soviet, invasion of Finland was a good thing, but it is to say that we have this, double standard of, if it was a Nazi, it was bad. If it was somebody fighting with the Nazis, it was good. And we have to memorialize them because there was Soviets involved. And so, like you mentioned with the Victims of Communism Foundation, we see examples, and I have also seen these examples of people who were very explicitly Nazi collaborators and also right-wing nationalists themselves. It wasn't just that they were fighting alongside the Nazis to protect their homeland or whatever. In the case of, I'll say the word, Ukraine, this was part of the Soviet Union. It wasn't in defense of their homeland. They were already part of the Soviet Union. They were collaborating with the Nazis for other reasons. Part of that reason was anti-communism, but also part of that reason was right-wing nationalism. Anyway, like I said, that was my controversial point, and I'm sure I'm going to get stick for that, but here we are.
No, thanks for that, Henry. So I'm going to make one comment, and then I think I will turn it over to wrap it up to you guys if there's any last things you want to say. So I'll give you some time to think about that. This is a paper that came out last year. I think it was December of last year. One of the authors was Jason Hickel, not to be confused with Jackson Hinkle. Jason Hickel. And so
there's a slight difference in quality between the two, I will add.
Yeah. And so he published this report, and it looked at the impact of British colonialism on colonial India. Through their research, they determined that about 100 million, excess deaths were caused by British colonialism just in 40 years of British colonialism there, when it expanded, I believe, multiple centuries.
And in India alone, it's worth underscoring that point, listeners. The whole anti-communist screed of the Black Book of Communism is that there was 100 million deaths due to communism, which, again, is a false number in general. But the example that you just laid out, and I'm sorry for cutting you off, Tony, I'll let you go ahead. But just to underscore this point, there was that many excess deaths in India alone in a 40-year period of time as a result of British colonialism, which was, their way of maintaining their capitalist system. That was the entirety of what was claimed by these weirdos, these weird anti-communist radicals, as being responsible, what communism in general was responsible for, including Nazis that died, including people that weren't born as a result of World War II, all of these things. That many people in India in 40 years. Anyway, sorry for that interruption. I just want to underscore that point because it really is a great example.
Yeah, that's totally fine. This is something that's kind of been like gnawing at my mind through our discussion. You know, we were talking about Stalin and the affirmative action programs that he implemented, the Soviet Union, the anti-racist programs, and then we'd mention MLK and the American Civil Rights Movement. And I feel like this is maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just, I feel strange saying it, but it's like, you know, given the impact Stalin had in respect to anti-colonial movements, the programs in the Soviet Union, that he had a much bigger impact on pushing forward racial equality significantly more than someone like MLK, who's held up in the U.S. as the man himself. So yeah, I'm just kind of stuck on that. But with that said, I will turn it over to my two guests to give any parting comments they wish in regards to our discussion, which of course is about the translation of their translation of Domenico Lusurdo's book, Stalin, A History and Critique of a Black Legend. Please go for it, Salvatore.
What you've just described, I mean, is something that is missing in Losurdo, and I think that would have been actually important to discuss in that respect. It is a very, very interesting, I think, a very apt way of putting it in terms of what are the major influences. MLK, of course, his sympathies towards socialism is usually denied. The speeches that would mention something to that effect are usually not part of mainstream discourse. One thing that I'm finding is, with respect to anti-colonial struggles, is yes, this major influence that came from the USSR, but also just going back to Gerald Horne, also this longer standing influence from the Haitian Revolution that is also, I think, part of the history that is very important and tends to get buried. I think needs to be brought forth, especially nowadays with this white racist, white supremacist revanchism in not just in the US, obviously. That takes me a bit further from the Losurdo discussion, but you're inspiring me to talk more about this. I mentioned before Paul Robeson, and I guess maybe I should go back to Paul Robeson, because one of the things that he would describe is going to the USSR and actually not feeling like he was being hounded by racists for the first time in his life. Something to that effect, if I recall correctly, his autobiography or the biography of Paul Robeson. And he wasn't alone. I mean, there was quite a major effort. It's not that the USSR necessarily succeeded in overcoming racism, but it certainly was an incredible effort that was, at least to a great extent, successful. It reverberates to this day. And that actually should bring into question, what is the excuse of all these extremely wealthy liberal democracies that tout all this, anti-racist stuff, whereas, they have no qualms about bombing black and brown countries out of existence, right? Why is Stalin regarded as in such a pejorative way? Whereas, you've got every single damn US president who's been some of the most evil, nasty kind of decision makers ever known in the history of humanity in terms of what they've done. We have Andrew Jackson in a $20 banknote, a genocidal maniac. We've got a plantation slave owner, named Washington. It should be
Woodrow
should
Wilson.
Be ashamed. Anyone
how can people always forget Woodrow Wilson?
Exactly.
He was one of the worst people to ever have power in any country.
Absolutely, that's really important. So, on the left, people really need to arm themselves with this understanding and shove it in people's faces every time they talk about Stalin. Say, what are you talking about? Like, look at yourself. Look at what you believe. You believe in genocide and slavery. That's what you really believe in, if you really think that you want to uphold this kind of system. And Stalin, in comparison, is progress. And I don't like to say it myself because there were horrific things done under the Stalin leadership, really horrific things. But we got to understand that we're dealing with systems, we're dealing with governments in liberal democracies that have no scruples whatsoever about wiping entire peoples out. And they've done so over and over again. And I really I would like for leftists, for the most part, to really grasp that and what the consequences of that are politically in terms of where efforts should be and what strategies to employ.
Yeah, I think that everything that Salvatore mentioned is absolutely the case. Just one thing that comes to mind briefly, and I'll try to be brief, and I do apologize. Listeners, we were recording this at 5 a.m. my time, so if I was a bit rambly, well, I have an excuse, but, do hold me to account to some degree, but, cut me a little slack on this one. One thing that comes to mind with regard to these anti-colonial struggles and the legacy of the Soviet Union and its revolution, actually the impacts of this are still seen today. And I know that this doesn't get much traction I know if I say the Western media, there's going to be a certain connotation that's put on that, and there's going to be a certain view of me that comes from that because there's a certain group of people that say the Western media. But I mean, broadly speaking, mainstream Western media, you're not going to see this, which is that if we look in places like the African continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and especially in places like the Sahel, but honestly, it goes all the way across the continent. What we see is that these individuals that live in these countries that have this very deeply held anti-colonial thought and deeply anti-neo-colonial thought, because, a lot of people, not people that listen to this podcast, I'm sure, but people in broader society, they have this idea, okay, decolonization happened, and therefore, wipe our hands, everything's hunky-dory, all is fine between former colonial master and former colonial, subservience. But that's not the case. I mean, neocolonialism was a process and is a process that continues to this day to all across, and again, I'm using the example of Africa very specifically, and I'll get to that in just a second, but all across Africa, we still see these neocolonial relations, in some countries more than others, but all across the continent, we see it. These people are inspired by the example of the Soviet Union, and they're inspired by the material and rhetorical support that they were receiving from the Soviet Union through its history, so much so that even today, when we see protests that are happening all across Africa, and again, particularly in the Sahel, but all across Africa, against the neo-colonial relations that are still present between those countries and their former colonial masters and other states that have, neo-colonial relations with them, like the United States, who, other than Liberia, didn't directly colonize these countries in Africa, but the relationship is still a neo-colonial one. What do we see? We see Russian flags all across Africa at these protests. That's not because the Russian government right now is giving them significant material support. And, there are connections that are being made between, leaders of these kind of anti-Western governments in Africa right now and Russia. And we do see there trying to be more integration between the Russian Federation and these states in Africa. But the reason we see these flags, the Russian flags across Africa, is not primarily because of what Russia is doing, but because of that historical example of the Soviet Union, the support that those countries received from the Soviet Union, and the inspiration of the example of the Soviet Union. The Russian flag is the existing, kind of successor state to the Soviet Union, ideologically completely different, but, the successor of the Soviet Union. That is still an emblem for these people to hold aloft and say, look, we don't have to be subservient to France. We don't have to be subservient to England. We don't have to be subservient to the United States, Portugal, Spain, whatever. There is another possibility. And in large part, that was due to what occurred during the Stalin administration, to kind of connect it back to this book. And as Salvatore mentioned, it's not really touched on too heavily in this book, but there are plenty of other works that do underscore this. So I think that reading this book, you shouldn't expect, again, as we mentioned at the beginning, this isn't a comprehensive book. You can't get all of the arguments here in this number of pages. That is one of the things that should have been included, even in spite of some other things that are included in the book. I think that that's a particularly relevant and important discussion. There should have been some room made for it in this book. But I want, in closing, to say that, again, regardless of your specific views of Stalin, I know everybody listening to the Actually Existing Socialism podcast is going to be anti-capitalist in some regard. If you're not, why are you listening to this. And if you are listening to this because you're just curious, you probably haven't made it this far if you're not at least somewhat in favor of dismantling capitalism. But I know that many on the left have deeply held negative feelings towards Stalin and the Soviet Union during Stalin's time in power. Regardless of those feelings, this is still an important work for you for two reasons. One, it's not a hagiography of Stalin. It is a way of analyzing what was happening at that time, but more importantly, analyzing the construction of a narrative. And that relates to the second reason why this is important, which is that this construction of narratives and this media perception, the way of changing the perception of a populace towards a figure or a political movement, is critically important for us to understand, because we are fighting against the system that we're currently living under. We are striving for a different system. And we know that there is going to be a concerted effort anytime we get anywhere near being successful in trying to dismantle the system, or even efforts that, get some sort of traction, even if they're not close to succeeding themselves. There is going to be an effort to smear. There's going to be an effort to discredit. And there's going to be an effort to tie you to a figure like Stalin. Understanding why this perception of Stalin was put together, understanding how this perception of Stalin was put together, and understanding how this perception of Stalin was then used as a way of bludgeoning socialists or, leftists of broader stripe as, being totalitarians in disguise. Critically important, because it is what we see. This is not some theoretical discussion. When you talk with people who are not on the left, this is often what you're hit with. Knowing how and why that came about is going to be critical for you to understand what you need to do to be able to combat that, because this is just frankly what we see. This is the portrayal of Stalin that we have in Western society. This is the sort of narrative that we have against socialists and communists. So understanding that is critically important. And as such, like I said, the PDF is freely available. If you don't have the financial resources to be able to afford a book, just download the PDF from the publisher's website. It's iskrabooks.org, ISKRA books.org. PDF is freely available. Or pick up the print copy. One thing that I've been suggesting is call your local library and recommend that they get it in stock. That way, not only are you able to get it without having to pay yourself, but also people in your community are going to have access to it. Start reading clubs about this book and discussion groups to talk about how these narratives are formed and what we need to do to be able to understand that, and what we need to do in order to combat that. These are all sorts of things. And I am happy to announce that as of yesterday, as of recording, the Toronto Public Library has just stocked a couple copies of the Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend translation that we did, which I bring up, one, because it's the biggest urban public library system in the world, and they've got a couple copies of this book, but also, Tony, because you're based in Canada, so it might be also relevant for you. But the library does have a couple copies. Regardless of where you're listening from, call your local library. You can find the Ibsen numbers on the Iskra Books website. I've tweeted them many times. Just call them, say, hello, I'd like to request you stock a copy or two of the Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend translation that was put out by Iskra. If more, if you ask very politely, they might get it. If more than one person calls, they most certainly will. And then you can utilize that as a way of working with others in your community to understand this material and be able to utilize this material, which is really the critical thing about reading anything. We don't just read for the sake of reading. We read to understand, and we read to act. And so that's my call to you, is to, in one form or another, get this book, make sure that this book is accessible to others around you in your community, and then utilize it.
Perfect. Thanks so much to both of you. I think that was a wonderful discussion. It definitely went longer than we'd anticipated, but that's all right. Some great points were made on all sides. I really appreciate the work both of you did in translating it. It's a very easy to read translation, despite some of the complex concepts in it. I do recommend, of course, people access the PDF or buy the book to read it, and read it maybe more than once, as I've done, to fully grasp all the different things that Lusurdo works through. Of course, he's written other books, and he's many other articles, shorter articles as well, where he expands on some of the different topics. So again, thanks to both of you for being on the show. Hopefully I look forward to talking to both of you in the future.
Likewise. Thank you loads. It's been a pleasure. Cheers.
Yeah, been a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.